I think this is the quietest time of my day. We're just going to wait another minute or two to begin as people are still coming on. So as people are starting to come on, I'm going to begin by welcoming everyone to this discussion today on simplifying the complexity of translation in clinical research. And do feel free, excuse me one sec. Do feel free to use the chat function. And you can also put questions for the audience and panel in the Q&A. And welcome everyone. This is one of a series of seminars that we hold on inclusion, equity in clinical research, which we've been running either bi-monthly or monthly since the fall. Could I have the next slide, please? So what you'll see is that we are closed captioning today. You can begin that closed captioning by clicking the closed caption button. And if you have, and then choose the subtitle size. So you have an option to increase the size if that is easier for you. Could I have the next slide? So I want to make sure that everyone knows that what we're discussing today is our personal views and not the views of any institution, company, organization, site, the US FDA, the Brigham and Women's Hospital, or Harvard. We are supported by contributions and grants, and those are available on our website. So we are independently speaking and serving in our individual capacity. Could I have the next slide, please? So we have, as I mentioned, had a long series of webinars. Those are all available with the webinar recording and slides. We initially started with a series of 7 webinars, sort of dissecting some work and doing a deeper dive into some of the work we've done. That was called Leaning In, and the next slide. And over the last 4 months, we've been doing monthly discussions of sort of specific issues in diversity, inclusion, and equity in clinical research. The webinars and recordings and the slides are available on our website for those prior to today, and today will be available probably Friday or Monday for you to download and to listen to. We are going to take a break in August and then return not with a monthly series, but really pausing to then highlight certain issues when they arise and scheduling those webinars appropriately. It's been an incredibly successful run with a lot of interest, but we really think that what we want to do is make sure that all time is well spent and really alert to issues emerging as they arise. So feel free to email us or talk to us when there is something that comes up that you'd like to explore further. And just to say to this audience who have been committed to this discussion and others, we're always available to talk to you and to hear ideas and participate going forward in work together. So with that, let me begin. Could I have the next slide? So I think most people on the call know the MRCT Center, the Multi-Regional Clinical Trial Center. We're a research and policy center at Harvard Medical School and the Brigham and Women's Hospital, dedicated to the ethics, conduct, and regulatory environment of international clinical trials. And we do that work by really pulling together diverse stakeholders to address a problem, but not just to define a problem, but really to explore how to make significant progress in addressing that problem. So we'll only take issues on that we think there are practical sort of policy practice issues that we can, as solutions, and we can make some headway. Could I have the next slide? So as most of you know, one of the major efforts that we've had is have many others over the last 3 years and longer, has been a real focus on driving inclusion, equity in clinical research. We started that work in 2017, and really it was led by ourselves, FDA, and individuals from industry, academia, and patient advocates, but really the work group represented a host of individuals representing widely disparate stakeholders in the clinical research enterprise. And really, we took a look at all of the components of clinical research, each component for which there are really very practical and identifiable issues for progress. Last year in August, we published the results of that discussion or meetings in a guidance and toolkit. I recommend you don't print it. It's about 400 pages, so either read it as available, download it, or buy it on Amazon, but don't try printing it. We've also developed a website for this and are remodeling that to keep it current. Could I have the next slide? So one of the real challenges is, in a multilingual society and across the world, how do we support individuals whose primary language is not English in the US or other languages in other domains? And we're going to explore that today. And sort of what are some of the issues involved and how can we make progress on that? So I'm really thrilled that we're going to hear from a stellar group. I'll introduce them a little bit later, but just to say, Megan Singleton, or they'll introduce themselves, is the Associate Dean for Human Research Protections and the Director of Human Research Protection Program at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. María Reyes is an internal medicine and infectious disease expert and the medical director of PanAmerican Clinical Research, running sites in Latin America, critical for the sort of inclusion of other Spanish-speaking individuals from Mexico, largely. And Ann Taylor is the CMO of AstraZeneca, dedicated to equity in clinical research with a stellar career both in pharma and academia. So could I have the next slide? Let me spend a couple of minutes introducing this. I became ever more passionate about it when on service. A Spanish-speaking person was admitted to my service. We were able to get him for a rare disease on a clinical trial. Spent several hours consenting him and then him and his family. And the next day I arrived, and next to his bed was a 37-page informed consent in English. He was Spanish speaking. He didn't speak a word of English. He didn't read English. His family didn't read English. And what was sitting next to him was a 1-paragraph Spanish short form. And I sort of looked at this and said, well, why does he have, to the team, why does he have the English version sitting here? It means nothing. And they said, well, it's a requirement. He has to be provided the entire informed consent. I said, he doesn't speak a word of English. What does that do? They said, well, it's a requirement. So one of the questions that we have is, when is the short form sufficient? When should documents be translated? Should people ever be excluded for language reasons alone? And if so, when? And what are the reasons that would be appropriate to exclude those people? And what steps should we take to increase inclusion while protecting the rights and welfare of participants? Obviously, a foundational core of this is that individuals will understand the research to which they're consenting. So could I have the next slide? So, this comes from a really deep-seated ethical sort of concern that we should be including individuals that are otherwise able to participate and are eligible. And that if we routinely exclude individuals with limited English proficiency, in other words, a limited ability to read, speak, write, or understand English from clinical research, it's discriminatory. And we would argue in that regard, access to clinical research is a protected right. It's also an ethical issue. If we think about our foundational principles of justice, people with limited English proficiency are unfairly prevented from accessing the benefits of clinical research participation. And scientifically, the generalization of those results is limited and likely contributing to health inequities. It's important when we realize that informed consent is a process. That is absolutely true. But provision of the short form is insufficient to provide the informed and voluntary participation of individuals with LEP. Even if you have an interpreter at the time, it is a requirement that we provide the full informed consent to English-speaking participants in the US. Why don't we do the same for other participants? And then in terms of, concerns with safety and benefit, do we worry about individuals with limited English proficiency who may be jeopardized during their participation in a clinical trial if they cannot speak the language, do not have a document to refer to, and may not have interpreter services available at the time? So what we're going to do now is to unpack this and see how far we can get in coming up with a different way of thinking about provision of translated materials and understandability. And that roots, could I have the next slide? In at least in the US, in both the Common Rule and FDA, that require information that is given to the subject or the representative shall be in language understandable to the subject or the representative. And the FDA goes on further to say that when the study subject population includes non-English speaking people, or the clinical investigator or the IRB anticipates that the consent interviews will be conducted in a language other than English, the IRB should require a translated consent document to be prepared and assure that the translation is accurate. So interesting guidance, not regulation, but guidance. And sort of what does that mean, and to what extent do we take those words and apply them appropriately? Could I have the next slide? So, certainly LEP, limited English proficiency, is a spectrum. If you think about people who are have trouble reading or writing, it's different than people who have trouble understanding for one reason or another, or whose primary language is other than English. In the US, LEP certainly intersects with race and ethnicity, and about 62 million people speak a language other than English at home. That is increasing over time. Most immigrants and those born to immigrant parents are the largest proportion of people that speak a language other than English. And interestingly, and unfortunately, those who have speak a language other than English at home are twice as likely to live in a household below the poverty line in the US. So that clearly speaks to the fact that this is an equity issue, and we need to address it. And while there are many, many people and many languages spoken in the US, and there is no official national federal language, certainly our largest portion are those who speak Spanish. Could I have the next slide, please? So we did a small study to look at how common it is for trials in the US to require people to read, write, speak, or be a native English speaker. And approximately 19% of studies required that when there was a site in the US in the last 2 years. That was disproportionate by therapeutic area, equally true in both federally funded and industry-sponsored trials, much more common in federally sponsored trials. And what we really need to think about is, how do we balance the time, the cost, the quality of translation or interpreter services, and the necessity for that, versus these fundamental ethical principles. Obviously, we cannot translate into 350 languages, and we don't even know what languages will be relevant and important. So, one question for us now is, what's the appropriate institutional and company policy for translation and interpreter services, given the need to balance the time and expense with practical utility? And we really want to think through what's a reasonable ask, what's an equity ask, and how does that interface and intersect with justice? Could I have the next slide? So when you think about starting a clinical trial, and you think about the language in which you should offer those materials, obviously that's very much dependent on who your anticipated population is. So on the one hand, you have a predicted population, perhaps, that will speak another language, but then there are also sporadic individuals that come into clinic or are identified. They could be a candidate, but it wasn't a predicted and predictable event. So those are two very different settings. Could I have the next? And if you think about those in the population, that's going to very much depend on geography and catchment. You can think about it in advance of or after study initiation. It does truly impact the time, the recruitment, if you are delayed in providing alternative languages, and sort of how many languages should we provide, and when do you need back translation? And when not. And that is an issue that really is considered by the IRB and the sponsor. That's very different than the sporadic person who happens to come in who speaks, a different language than those that you have the materials available in. And that's when we think about using interpreter services and short form documentation. And when should you follow up with greater information? When does the risk of the research impact that decision as to whether to include them? And should there be a minimum threshold after which translation is required? If you get the first person who speaks Portuguese, that's one thing, but if you're on your sixth, is that another? And is there a threshold for risk? And if you say, well, if it's 5%, then really we should be translating those documents. The person who gets it, at the sixth, after the sixth, will get those translated documents earlier in their journey than the first. But those are really sporadic individual decisions are made at the investigator level and the institutional level, and therefore we should think about what guidance we should be providing for them. Could I have the next slide? So what are the disincentives? Obviously, time. It takes a lot longer to do a consent with an interpreter and to find them and schedule them, etc. Document translation, back translation, or validation is also time consuming. And then, at least in the US, we have an expectation that we send those in for review and approval, which takes additional time. There's obviously costs involved, cost of the translation and interpreter. Those incremental costs are often not anticipated, and often, it's not clear who should be paying for them, and it becomes a negotiation. We don't want to be translating things that we don't think are going to be necessary. So how often will they be? What is the balance of utility? And then this issue of ensuring participant safety. So could I have the next slide? So, today we want to sort of assume the ethical principles and really dig into how to do this right. When is it necessary to translate? Alternatively, when do you think it's not necessary to translate? Do the same standards apply to minimal risk and greater than minimal risk research? Can we agree on threshold numbers or expectations, or should we be arguing that we should have a different philosophy about this? In terms of non-English speakers in the US and primary language speakers in other countries. If it's indicated, what should one translate? The entire informed consent form, the research part, the key information, how soon should those be available? How much latitude are we going to let the translation services, certified translation services provide? And are there special considerations for interpreter services? And then what are the expectations of each of the players, the investigator, clinical trial sites, institutions, IRBs, and sponsors? We've talked a lot today already about what is sort of good enough and what standards would inform best efforts. I do want to say before we move to thinking about this, we've been talking about participant-facing materials. We're also going to touch on all the other materials that are necessary when you do a language or a trial in another country. Including the actual protocol itself, the investigators' brochures, et cetera, et cetera. So with that, let me introduce again the group that we're going to be hearing from. I think we'll ask Maria to lead us off in talking about the real experience on the ground, and then follow with Anne and Megan. And maybe we could turn off the and that would be great. So Maria, up to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank for this kind invitation for this meeting. I am an infectious disease and an internal medicine specialist. I am currently a medical director for PanAmerican in Mexico and Latin America, and I am working in a clinical site here in Mexico, and as a PI of some of the studies we have in the site. So I would like to share some of the experience that we have faced, or the challenges that we have faced here at the site, on this topic. First of all, clinical research is very important for Latin America. I think it's a way to improve medical progress in our region. In these middle and low income countries, sometimes clinical research is the first option that our population gets to access to medical care, from a first medical evaluation, from getting access to diagnostic tests, or access to the best standard of care, of the best treatment. Because limited resources in our countries are always an obstacle to get access to all these interventions. So this is a very, very, very important tool for our region. There are also some diseases that have high representation here in the region, like some infectious diseases, for example, obesity and diabetes in children or adolescents. So it's important to bring clinical research to our countries. One of the main obstacles we have, as you know, are the timelines. Our timelines are not very competitive. The times for regulatory submission and approvals are always longer than the timelines for other countries. So we are always starting late in time with most of our trials. When we have to wait for translation of all the materials that we have to submit, because in Mexico, for example, we have to make all the submission of the protocol, the ICF, the investigator brochure, and of course, all the materials for the participants in Spanish, in the local language. So usually when everything is ready to start with the trial in other countries and other sites are starting with enrollment, we are still waiting to get those documents in our language so we can submit them to the ethics committee and then to the MOH. So that usually takes around 3 to 6 weeks. So this is a delay for us in the start of a trial. We always try to review everything because we have found that sometimes there are some mistakes in the translated materials. And then if we send it that way to the ethics committee, they will take that back to us. We have to make the corrections with the CRO and the sponsor, and then we have to start this process all over again. So we lost maybe another month or another couple of months. We had some COVID trials recently, and one of them we required to make like a fast enrollment. And at the end, after all this process, we had 1 week before the study closed out because the global enrollment goal was met, and we just could enroll 1 patient because we have a very, very short time. So that's also that also has an impact in cost in the planning of a trial, in activating a site, and then starting with this delay is a disadvantage for us. We always feel like this is the translation is a process that is left at the end of the planning of a trial. It's not taken as a priority from the beginning. Maybe if it could be known out front that they are going to take the trial to certain countries with other languages, maybe it could start as a simultaneous process earlier, so they can be ready at the same time, and we can start with enrollment at the same time as other sites. As you were saying also, we are required to have all these materials translated, but many of the communications of the trial, for example, the communications between the sponsor and the site, many of the trainings and some of the investigator meetings, the safety reports, those remain in English for our sites. So if the site or the investigator is not proficient in English, that could be also an obstacle, and that could jeopardize the correct conduct of a trial. We also had one big study. It was around 1,500 participants. And then some preliminary results were released in press communication in the internet with results that were not as good as expected. Obviously, this information got to all of our volunteers. And we were waiting for official communication by the sponsor so we can deliver this to the volunteers. But that took like 2 weeks to get it translated into Spanish. Then we have to submit it to the ethics committee, and then it would reach the volunteers like 4 weeks after they get access to the information online. So obviously subjects felt that we were late with this information. We had to contact one by one by phone and explain them what was the situation of the trial and explain a little detail on the results so they could feel like we were communicating with them. But that's also a barrier, that also causes mistrust sometimes in our subjects. There is also, for example, the ICF in Mexico requires to have 2 witnesses, always. It's not only for vulnerable or for non-Spanish speaking populations. We always have to include 2 witnesses in the informed consent. They have to put the relation to the subject. They have to put the address. For some studies, also the people that explains the consent has to sign, the people that obtains the consent, and then the principal investigator. So our process of informed consent gets obviously more complex with all these requirements. So there are some differences that make our trials more complex here in Mexico.
So thank you. So it sounds like there's both timeliness and predicting and planning for inclusion, specific issues that are country differences in practice and culture, and also this very, very important piece of making sure that the communications are timely between sponsor, CRO, site, and participant. So there's lots of things to unpack there. Thank you so much. And maybe you could give us, if not the general sponsor perspective, your perspective.
Thank you. Yes, I think I can represent sponsors, and I want to thank you all for inviting me here today, because I think I'm learning more than I'm going to provide. We are one of those sponsors that very frequently has an inclusion criteria that you must be able to speak English and understand English. And so this is just, so one of the first steps, I think, is getting across the awareness that this is an ethical issue and we need to be much more open about how we manage it. And then the majority of the comments from María, I think, are managed by better planning, right? Some of it is that we started trials small and then we're always disappointed in how fast we're recruiting. And so we late decide to go to multiple other countries. And so we haven't planned ahead for the translations, and we're doing it the last minute or responding to country-specific IRB feedback. But obviously we could be planning ahead because the majority of our trials are global. We know what countries we're going to or what countries to go to often, and be preparing those translated materials much further in advance. And I think that would help. The other piece I want to add to this is we should all, as a community, start thinking how we use technology to solve some of these problems. Yes, we need to be aware of them and we need to be initiating, but Google Translate is getting pretty good. And there are some additional AI type mechanisms for translation that are a good start. But then we do need to think, as you said, Barbara, about the level of validity of the translation that's required. Is Google Translate good enough? And what are those situations? And what are the situations where Google Translate, or I shouldn't use a proprietary name, but an AI program can provide the first start, and then a native speaker would review it for accuracy. And then of course there are things like patient-reported outcome questionnaires where we do want the back translation and the absolute accuracy of the terminology and the phraseology. Another component would be, as we discussed yesterday, is the subtleties of the translation, whether Spanish translation formally is acceptable in every Spanish-speaking community across the world, or whether you need culturally sensitive modifications for localities, which of course brings additional complexity to the piece. And finally, to think about as we're getting more and more automated in doing clinical trials, where we can use content authoring and segment authoring for translation as well. So the boilerplate parts that are the specific regulatory rules for a particular country or a particular site could be translated once and then just plugged in each time, where you only have to add on the incremental translation of the new knowledge or the new details about that particular intervention or that particular study, rather than redoing the whole thing every time. And we could have libraries of components of the consent that would speed it up. So I think as organizations and a community, we should be thinking more about how to make this more efficient. But thank you very much. I'm really enjoying learning about this and getting great ideas on what we as a company can do a lot better.
So helpful. In this idea, there you've said so much. Sort of when is automated translation good enough, and what is the liability, therefore, of inaccuracy if it's sponsor given, or to the institution if it's inappropriately translated? What are the issues in cultural sensitivity about this, and sort of uniqueness? And then this whole idea of segmental or translation of what we used to call the boilerplate, and sort of how to work that in. And it might be one thing for a huge company like AstraZeneca, it might be a different for a clinical trial site like PanAmerican.
Mm-hmm.
So Megan, maybe you could talk to us about both the institutional and the IRB perspectives on this.
Thanks, Barbara. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for this opportunity. I do have to say that both Maria and Anne's comments also really resonated with me. I serve in my role as the Associate Dean for Human Research Protections, and in that role I oversee our IRBs at Johns Hopkins. So I see this both from the researcher perspective, but also the IRB member and committee perspective in terms of the things that they're looking at and dealing with, and the questions that they have about really how to improve this. So one of the things from the researcher perspective that really resonated with me that Maria said is, I do think we have to do better with the process. I think that we really have to look hard at where we are creating process inefficiencies. We've had teams come to us and say, I always am going to be behind in enrolling my Spanish-speaking participants because of the fact that the process is designed that the consent always comes later. And it not only comes a little later, as Maria mentioned, it comes vastly later. And that is not only for the initial consent, but every piece of information that needs to be communicated to participants after that first moment. And so I think we really have to, as IRBs and organizations, we have to look hard and say, have we complicated the process more than is needed to from a regulatory perspective? There's great variability in how IRBs address this. And for researchers, it's super frustrating. Some IRBs require that you submit a certificate of translation. Others require that you submit a back translation. Others require both. And researchers have to obtain this information, understand what the IRB expectation is, submit it to that IRB. And I honestly, and I think Barbara, you've raised this several times, it's questionable as to what IRBs are effectively doing with the information once they've received it. So I think we need to look hard at whether we are substantively improving the timeline in process changes, and how do we do that? The other thing from an institutional perspective is I think that we need to make a real commitment to not have this be the work of every individual researcher on their own. We have researchers who have worked very, very hard. They've built this into their budget. They've made great community connections. They've found a translation service that has a potential to review for cultural appropriateness. And when we have others that say, I've never even thought of this and don't know where to start. And by putting the onus of responsibility solely on investigators to figure this all out, I think we're automatically creating an inequity that we have to change. So I really think from an institutional perspective, we have to look at how do we stand up resources to make this easier, to make it not occur study by study, but to have those resources be existing and in place so that they're available for researchers and don't have to be created on a study by study basis.
Really interesting. So if you dig into what you think of as resources, what would they be? Sort of a translation service, trained interpreters in research? What else is there?
I think there could be a number of ways. So one could be by contracting with preferred vendors to offer reduced rates for translation services, so that a translation service could be readily accessible at a reduced institutional rate. Another way might be to have a circumstance where you have a research-specific translation or interpretation service. A lot of us rely on our institutional clinical services, whereas research-based services may be needed to actually truly help support research teams. So I think that there's a lot of potential for growth here. And I hope that we can really make those institutional commitments to look at some of these opportunities.
That's great. That's great. And when you think about sort of the company perspective in terms of what seems like a reasonable approach to this, do you have thoughts about sort of the programmatic versus the specific one, the one-offs?
I think it's a really good point, Barbara. And as I dug a little, because I've never had to do this particularly myself, I realized that in fact it is program by program and we don't have an overall approach. In most cases, the team writes the protocol in English, then the operations team figures out what countries, then they go and get something translated, but the country offices are responsible for the translations instead of us saying centrally, we're going to need X, Y, and Z languages. Let's just get it done all at once. Because of course you could use French in the Caribbean, not just in Paris, right? And you could use Spanish a lot of different places, and we would probably drive some efficiencies if we thought more globally. And this is exactly what I mean why this conversation is enlightening me so much on what we could do to do things a lot better. And we do believe it's part of the cost of our business to provide these. So we also need to be more upfront and just planning ahead in terms of the budgets for it.
And just to say from our side, on the investigator side, that there would be no problem with investigators who require translation then sending it back to the sponsor or CRO and saying, look, we just have to translate this into Italian. Here you go. You can use it or not.
Yeah, that would be nice.
Right
but if
now, we don't do any of that.
Yeah.
You know.
No, it's a great idea. Or to say, we, as Megan says, we have preferred providers that give us a discount and have already done these things many times. So we could probably get it translated cheaper than having each of the sites have to do it. And we could provide the Italian that we sent to Italy, right, to Boston as well. But we aren't thinking globally that way yet.
And we're not thinking, at least institutionally, systematically, as Megan says and as Maria says. Yeah. We could also develop boilerplate for our institution. If we have specific subject injury language or who to call, why do we reinvent that every time?
Right.
And it actually argues for rethinking informed consent in terms of here's the things that are ever constant, and here are the research specific issues. I do want to say that in my role as head of one of the programs at the Harvard CTSA, the Clinical and Translational Science Award, we spent a couple of years developing sort of routine informational brochures about routine research procedures and questions, your rights as a research participant, what's it like for an IRB, for what is an IRB, but a CT scan or an MRI or, all of those kinds of routine procedures that PIs never spend the time saying, you know, this is what happens when we ask you to do acupuncture or whatever. And those are now translated and generally available in 22 languages. So we've tried to sort of jumpstart some of this, and we'll make those available to everyone. But, you know, thinking about how we can do this at scale is exactly the problem. And Maria, as you talk about this issue then of communication with the individuals, it's really bringing this scalable idea right down to home. How do you make sure that that's done in a timely way that's respectful of the participants? You know, it's a really good point.
And Maria made it really clear that's a key barrier. If we're actively trying to get more Hispanic patients and then we delay 6 months to getting access to them, we've just completely caused our own barriers to fair and distributed recruitment.
And are there ever, you know, one of the problems, I think, at least for global companies that are, you know, largely conduct their business in English, and as well as institutions in the States and other major English-speaking countries, is that we get all of this together and then translate. At the point, you know, at what point should we routinely, here's the investigator's brochure. It's not going to change much between now and when we've written the protocol. Send that to translate, at least in Spanish. And start here with, you know, 2 languages at least are English and Spanish. Let's just start there. And then you can, as an institution, define your additional population. So there may be, you know, in Baltimore, an additional population that you need to consider. And that's been true in some institutions where they require their catchment area, the materials always available in that way, you know.
Barbara, I want to build on that point a little bit, because one of the other things that I think would be really helpful, and I know that you're working on this already, is some tools for IRBs to guide the decision-making. So like a very clear and bright rule is there's no case where we really shouldn't be thinking about having materials available in English and Spanish, right? Right now, IRBs are largely deciding this on a study-by-study basis with not a lot of great information. Some may make a rule based on catchment area and the targeted population. Some may ask a researcher, what is the demographics of the individuals who are most affected by the targeted disease condition? But there's no specific way that people are applying to decide when is translation required? What's the threshold? So even starting with some basic bright line rule, I think would get us so much farther than we are right now.
You know, but then we get to Anne's complexity of like EPROs, you know, or even just PROs, diaries. What are we doing with that? What do we do with the outcome measures? When we did this little review of CTGov, the therapeutic area that was most requiring of English proficiency was depression. Well, you can understand that, you know, that there are, you know, language concordance between a psychiatrist and their patient is important. So what do we do with that? I think that's exactly where, you know, the IRB and then the investigator needs to think about that, and what's really necessary versus what's reflex. And right now, lots reflex that doesn't need to be.
It also reflects, of course, the health inequities that go out there relative to care of those patients as well.
You're 100% right. 100%. Yeah. Yeah. Good. So just to that point, a lot of the metrics or the measures that we use, the outcome measures, are developed and validated in English. We should really think about starting a process where, you know, the first time, it reminds me a little bit like all the cardiovascular studies in the 70s were done on men, and, you know, if it works in men, then we'll do women kind of thing. I know that that doesn't seem like a normal progression from this, but it seems like, you know, people say, well, we'll do it in English, and then if it works, we'll translate the, you know, the tool into Spanish, or we should start thinking about making those, you know, common tools that we use available and validating them, which is a whole other process that nobody really owns, right?
And a whole area of research to fund, right? So, and an important complement to this.
So if you had to point to the real barriers in translation, besides cost, are there barriers that we should appreciate?
I also think that something important is that the translation is made by somebody with biomedical knowledge or biomedical background also. Sometimes we find that the protocol, the translated protocol or the translated brochure is not as accurate as the original protocol. We even like to make some of the trainings, or when we look for something specific in the protocol, we go back to the original version, because sometimes the medical terms are different. It's not like just changing one word from English to Spanish. It's like you have to give it a context so you can get the accurate term to say exactly what they are meaning in the original document. And also the differences between Spanish in different countries or different regions. Is the same language, but sometimes the order of the sentences, of the meaning of some specific word, would be different in Spain than the ones that we use in Mexico or in Colombia. It's not just that we have the same language and the same meaning for everything. It has to be adapted maybe per country. And I think always review by people with biomedical background, so we can be sure that everything is reflecting the accurate information from the protocol.
That's a great point. And for sponsors, are there barriers that we haven't talked about?
I think the majority of the barriers are lack of awareness and lack of planning ahead. I know that one of our challenges is we have so many amendments, and so then you have to get things done again. Maria's point about urgent safety notification is absolutely valid, and we need to find ways to do it faster. So I really think this is also a tech problem that we should be applying new ways of working to it, and I think we can find ways to make it easier, and we just haven't prioritized this. I have to say we need to.
It's such a great point. You know, I also think liability is something we need to think about. You know, we're doing such a bad job now. How do we do better and not let this sort of inchoate risk of being sued for, you know, the word that isn't accurate, limit doing better than we're doing today, which is having nothing documented or written so that you can never get there. Yeah, it's a really interesting point. And Megan, for IRBs and institutions, are there things that we should address that we haven't talked about?
Yeah, I think there's two things. I did want to build on Maria's comment. I think one of the things that we've seen that's been most concerning, and we have some great partners that we've been able to work with, is just appropriateness for cultural considerations. So it's not just about the translation of words, but you know, part of this is also just, I think, how do we increase transparency about the imperfection of the document? So if we can say this is a translated document and it might not be perfect, if you have any questions, like, please ask. That is really honest, right? And it at least says this is really honest, right? And I think one of the things that we've heard is the presentation of information that's not perfect without that context really calls into question some of the trust and the communication issues that Maria raised, which is like, this is not a great document even as translated, right? So that's one of the things I really think we have to think about, is owning the imperfections in the process. The other piece of it is that, you know, I think we're still heavily dependent upon clinical services.
Yeah.
And it's a really big challenge because our clinical services have the same goals. They want to be available, but they are stretched thin, right? And I think that it's an unfair expectation to say that they can assume all of the work. So
Right.
we have to think about alternatives.
That's a really good point. And I think if we were honest about, you know, the limitations, this is a translated document, it also goes pretty far towards addressing that concern. And we should think about that. It's a great point. Let me take, in the final minute, two questions that are in the chat. One is, what's the goal of having a lay language consent, the key information, and are there considerations specific to preparing an English consent that will be translated? In other words, are there issues that we take on in English informed consent documents that make it harder for those preparing or being consented with translated documents? Megan?
I think that's such a great question. I've heard personally from some of the folks that we worked with that our boilerplate is tough. The wording is very precise. And so when trying to translate that, so thinking about, I think it's a very interesting thing. Like, you need to really think hard about how do you craft the English version to prep for good translation. And I think we've spent like so much time poring over really precise boilerplate language that just doesn't always translate well. There is no comparable good word, right? And so I think that is something we have to think about. Should we look at coming up with language that is more lay friendly, that might be more translatable, to prepare documents for better translation or easier translation? It's a really awesome question, actually.
Oh, and that's true of the boilerplate language in general, you know, that it's particularly arcane and people, you know, and intentionally so. Why don't you just have a separate, you know, if you're going to do research in this, you know, in this institution or with this company or whatever, here's the boilerplate. Here's what, like the consent when you go into a hospital, you know, and then like a blood transfusion, you get your specific consent for the research. And then it's clear what's the research and what's the institution, you know? So interesting.
It bothers me to hear this discussion of a lay language consent, because it's supposed to be for the person who's reading it. We shouldn't even have a question about whether it's lay language, but it's true.
But we spent about a year and a half just trying to align the boilerplate language of the Harvard hospitals so that we didn't have to ping back and forth all the time. The IRB and human research protection staff all agreed, and the lawyers did not. So we've got some work to do there too. So on the final 3 minutes, 1 minute each, lightning round, what do you want to see in the future? We'll start with Maria.
I think to include translation earlier in the planning of a trial, to be able to see from the beginning where do you want to take that trial, and start working on that maybe earlier so everything is ready at the same time. And the other important thing is to have this biomedical feedback about the translation of at least these main materials, the protocol, the investigator brochure, the ICF, to have that in an understandable language, not just the translation, but to make it friendly and to make it understandable for foreign language speaking people.
Great. Anne.
For us, I would say a program-wide process that we start at the beginning. It will feed into Maria's planning, but it also, I think, will reduce a lot of duplication that we do.
Yeah, and expense. Yeah, and Megan.
So I have two. One, I would really love for IRBs to look hard into their own processes to see if they have ways to take out barriers to the review and approval of translated documents. And then the second is from an institutional perspective. I hope that we can start a bit of accountability by at least tracking the data. How well are we doing? How many times have we translated? For which studies? Are we getting better at it over time? I think we need to make a commitment to at least track this information so we can look at and evaluate our opportunities for improvement. And we don't have access to that at our fingertips right now. So I hope that from the institutional perspective, we can make a commitment not only to resources, but to really track how we're doing.
Yeah, and I would add not only to the number of languages, but also to the time delay in providing that information. You know, so which circles back. Well, I have to say we're at the top of the hour. This hour flew for me. Lots to do, lots to think about. And, you know, having the community at large think about this and work together to change the future is really terrific to have you all. And thank you so much.
Thank you all. It's great to meet you.
Good to see you.
Thank you for having us.
All right. Thank you.